Be seated, please. Back up.
I'm just going to read portions of that transcript. I've edited out some of the portions. Even the defendant was being sentenced and was called. The judge called upon him to make such statement as he might wish to influence the sentencing. The defendant, and I want you to assess the coolness. Defendant, I don't know how much weight you can put on what I have to say. I am an alcoholic, not the sort that has to have a drink every single day. But when I do drink, I go overboard, and I imagine that labels me as being an alcoholic. Some discussion back and forth between him and the judge on that. Then the defendant, the prosecution has raised very serious charges against me, and I can understand why. What I've done is very serious. I never meant to give anyone the impression that I thought otherwise. I've never been in this position before. Nothing this awful. This is a nightmare come true. If anything would shock me out of my past behavior patterns, it's this. The one thing I have in my mind is that is stable and that gives me some source of pride is my job. I've come very close to losing it because of my actions, which I take full responsibility for. I'm the one to blame for all of this. What I've done has cut both ways. It's hurt the victim and it's hurt me. It's a no-win situation. All I can do is beg you please spare my job. Please give me a chance to show what I can, that I can tread the straight and narrow and not get involved in any situation like this ever again. I would not only ask, I beg you please, don't destroy my life. I know I deserve a great deal of punishment. I'm not trying to elicit your sympathy, but I would ask you please, don't wipe me out completely. Some discussion about sexual problems. Then the defendant goes on. But I have had such the judge says, do you have relationship with adult males? This, of course, involved a minor. The defendant, I have had in the past, not recently. This enticing a child was the climax of my idiocy. It's going to destroy me. I'm afraid this one incident. I don't know what in the world I was thinking when I did it. I know I was under the influence. As far as purposely drugging him, that was never my intention. I've been taking sleeping pills because I work third shift for several years now. I take quite a few of them because I built up a tolerance to them, and it was never my intention to purposely drug him. I wouldn't have offered him money if I had planned on drugging him. But nevertheless, I'm not trying to excuse what I did.
I'm sorry, you're asking me a question?
Basically, does this show a rather cool, collected person under a great deal of stress? The judge could put him up for, as I recall, it's 20 years for the two counts that were involved. Was enticing, getting him off the street into the house, one count. The touching in the house was 2 counts. I believe that's 20 years.
Right.
Rather cool presentation for a man facing 20 years. Would that be accurate?
Yes, and I furthermore believe at that stage, and I'd said this earlier, that he was not interested in stopping. I think he'd made up his mind it was his destiny, and he was not going to believe the treatment was going to be helpful. It's interesting because he used something similar with me, saying that now this time he'd learned a lesson, and he wouldn't be out, but hypothetically, if he were, he'd be okay, and I didn't believe that for a moment either.
It's a rather manipulative lie to the court.
Well, it's clearly not honest.
And also, in terms of the time that in the Conarac Symphysis phone incident, the 14-year-old Laotian boy at North 25th and West State Street, where he had drugged him and then went out for drinks, where the defendant went out for drinks. The Laotian boy apparently awakened, got out of the apartment, made his way a block or two to North 25th and West State. Citizens were there, fire truck arrived, police arrived, and the defendant managed to persuade the police that there was nothing foul afoot. Is that correct?
Yes, particularly remarkable since there was a body in a room right next door with a door.
Absolutely. Did it on the street. They came into the dwelling, and right there, which to me would call for a great deal of cool, the defendant, same way that he was caught, same was the body in the garbage bags, and the police officer 3 feet away. Here we have it again with Conarac Symphysis phone, and he's apparently capable of persuading the officers, is he not?
Yeah, he wasn't cool because we talked about it. He was, as you can imagine, extremely anxious, but he was certainly able to present it in a way where, tragically, the officers had no sense of what was really going on. That's correct.
I want to talk about some alternatives available to this defendant to relieve his sexuality. You do know that he went to bathhouses in Milwaukee, was excluded because of the drugging, and then started going to bathhouses into Chicago. I think that went on into 1991. To my knowledge, he was never excluded from a bathhouse in Chicago and could have continued to go to those bathhouses. Are you aware of that as an alternative?
Well, again, I don't want to quibble. I wouldn't accept alternative because, as I said in my testimony earlier, the fact that he's capable of other kinds of sexual activity doesn't necessarily erase these cravings. And if the cravings become overpowering, just because he can have normal sex isn't necessarily the treatment or the solution of the problem.
The following alternatives were also available to him. He occasionally paid people for sexual services. And as you know, certainly if a person wishes to simulate a prostitute to simulate lying unconscious or lying dead, such a prostitute will do that. He also could have handcuffed his partners if he wanted that. And there was evidence, of course, that he did, in fact, procure handcuffs in terms of control. There was evidence that he could use a mannequin, apparently drew some pleasure. That's called Pygmalionism. He could have procured another mannequin, bought one. Indeed, in some sexual service places, they provide mannequins, do they not, as an alternative. He did render some of his sexual partners unconscious, drew relief, evidence that he had orgasm, climax, before they were dead in a number of the cases, and certainly drew relief without killing them by rendering them unconscious. He continued, apparently used the alternative of pornography and masturbating, and could have continued to do that. Yes.
You're asking a whole series of questions here. You're not getting any answers.
Yes, I'm just pointing out a list of alternatives, and I'll ask, is that those alternatives were available? Okay. That was my intent.
I thought I detected several separate questions with no answers, and that leaves the record a little empty.
Yeah, fine, Judge. I'm suggesting alternatives.
Go ahead.
And, of course, developing a long-term homosexual relationship. Those alternatives were available to relieve sexual drives. Not exactly what he wished, and a lot of people don't get exactly what they wish, but those were available to relieve those drives, were they not?
Well, again, it's going to be the same answer that I gave you before in terms of how I view the issue of alternatives. The fact that you pointed out he had someone in handcuffs and the fact that he had him in handcuffs and alive wasn't satisfying the craving that, in my opinion, was driving him. So in that sense, I don't accept it as alternative. I understand how how someone can see it that way.
In terms of hard sciences and soft sciences, psychiatry is a soft science, isn't it?
I want to answer carefully because, I don't want to quibble. It doesn't have the technology, for example, if we're comparing it with open heart surgery. But I don't want to go too far with that. Psychiatrists are trained in medicine. They go through all the various rotations in medicine. There's a lot of training about trying to maintain objectivity. There are some developing technologies now that look at brain function. I think as in any other area of medicine, people talk about the science of medicine and the art of medicine. I think there is a scientific base for psychiatry. I spent many years training in psychology and medicine and so on. But the technologies that might let you say it's a hard science like surgery, there I'd say no, it's not a hard discipline of medicine in the same sense as hard surgery.
In a hard science, there's the use of the experimental method. The tester tightly controls the matter to be studied, controls the environment, uses standard instrumentation and documentation, and can measure somewhat definitively what transpires in the experiment. Is that accurate?
But we do the same thing, sir. We just, for example, have applied for a grant to do what's called a double-blind study to make sure the medicines we're using.
I asked him a question, and he, as he does, volunteers. That's how a hard science is connected, is it?
Mr. McCann, restate the question. Dr. listen to Mr. McCann's question and answer the question.
Is it not true in the hard sciences? They use the experimental method. The tester tightly controls the matter to be studied, controls the environment, uses standard instrumentation, and can measure somewhat definitively what transpires in the experiment.
And what I'm trying to say, because the answer is
yes or no, doctor. It's yes or no.
Okay, in the hard sciences, then the answer is yes, that those methods are important.
And one can establish, by doing the same experiment, can definitively predict and analyze what's transpiring. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the sciences such as psychiatry, you do not conduct experiments in the strict sense. It's mainly observational, to a very good extent observational, observing people, listening to people, what their problems are, and analyzing the differences. and undertake much of psychiatry is that, is it not?
No, sir, that's where I disagree. And again, I hope I can explain why, because the answer is no. I'm not avoiding the question, but I was, I guess, a step ahead of you, and I don't agree with that. And is it okay if I explain why I don't?
Well, you can do that on redirect, Doctor.
All right, if you don't want me to anymore.
Certainly within the field of medicine, in terms of analyzing a problem. If a person has a broken leg, you can sit down and the doctors, the bone doctors will look it over, take x-rays, and can pretty definitively tell you what the problem is, can they not?
Certainly in a broken leg, one can definitively tell that someone has a broken leg.
And there's technology that can do that, such as x-rays, and give a pretty definitive answer.
That's correct.
And there is not such technology of that nature, that hard technology in the field of psychiatry, that you can analyze a problem with the same definitive certitude.
Sometimes there is. If a patient had delirium, we could do an EEG if it showed diffuse slowing that would confirm a psychiatric diagnosis of delirium.
Let's just take the idea of paraphilias themselves, just within the field of medicine, without looking to the courts at all. Just how doctors perceive it. Some doctors would say, yes, that could be such a disease as would qualify under the ALI legal test. Other psychiatrists would say, no, that isn't such a disease as would qualify under the ALI test. I'm talking now just what psychiatrists think about it without thinking what saying courts do. Am I accurate on that?
Psychiatrists could disagree on whether or not they wanted to call that a disease.
In terms of, they might say, yes, it's a paraphilia. They may agree that it's a paraphilia. But in terms of, in other words, some might say it is not a disease. Some psychiatrists would say it's not a disease.
Yes, I think I covered that in the original questioning, and I agree that the answer to that is yes.
Does that fall, do you have any your impressions yourself about what the percentage breakdown is in psychiatrists? Now, grant you, there's been no assessing or surveying of psychiatrists.
About whether the psychiatrist would agree that paraphilia is a disease?
Yes.
I won't guess on it.
Right. So, but then there's a substantial percentage that say, no, it is not a disease. Would that be accurate?
I don't know that that's correct either.
But there's definitely a division. You'd agree on that?
There are some people who would say it isn't a disease. I would agree with that.
So, and you have no idea what the percentage breakdown is?
As you pointed out, there's never been a systematic survey done.
Right. And for some reason, you're reluctant to opine on it. Is it?
I'm reluctant because every time I try to talk, you tell me you don't want me to say so much. So I'm trying not to say too much.
In any event, there's even on the basic issue, is paraphilia a disease? There's a disagreement on that within psychiatry.
To try to answer it directly without expanding, yes, there's a disagreement.
The paraphilia is basically defined, it's looked at as a problem, as a mental disorder within the DSM-3R because of the object that is for which the affection or the attraction lies. Is that correct?
Not exactly. It's looked at as an abnormality in DSM-3R because people are experiencing something different in terms of their mental state than what's normal. And if you're having abnormal mental experiences, we psychiatrists say that's a mental disorder.
It's not abnormal to have recurrent sexual urges or to have recurrent sexually arousing fantasies, is it?
That's sure abnormal to walk around all day having fantasies about having sex with corpses.
Doctor, you didn't answer my question.
What's the question?
The question was, it's not abnormal, is it, to have recurring intense sexual urges and recurring sexual fantasies? That in and of itself is not abnormal, is it?
Not necessarily.
Right. And for a person, the abnormality that relates why it qualifies a paraphilia is the object of those fantasies. And in this particular case, the object would be, depending whether you accept an unconscious person or a living compliant person or a dead person. In this case, you've made the necrophilia, started you down that path because there were dead bodies involved with some sex. Is that correct?
It is the content of the fantasies, not the object. I'm saying no, I don't agree with you saying the object. I'm saying the content of the fantasies, having that kind of mental content recurrently running through your head and a content is associated with intense sexual arousal is abnormal.
All right. It's the content being a dead body. That's what makes it.
Content being all we've talked about, okay? I don't want to repeat because you're asking me to be brief. But
all right. If a person simply has this recurrent thing about a dead body, would that qualify as a paraphilia? Recurrent sexual urges, recurrent sexually arousing fantasies, just about a dead body. Would that qualify?
That would qualify if they're having intense, recurrent, sexually arousing fantasies and urges about having sex with a dead body. The definition included, it wasn't even relevant to say it had to be at least 6 months. This has gone on here for years. If I'm walking around for more than 6 months having intense, recurrent, sexually arousing fantasies and urges about having sex with a dead body, I got a mental disorder.
All right, we got a person now, a human being that is going around having recurrent, intense sexual desires with recurrent sexual fantasies about, he's a man, about an attractive woman that lives next door. That goes on for months and even a year. Is he mentally ill? Got a disorder?
I'm not trying to avoid it. I doubt it, but you're a hypothetical guy. I'm not examining as a doctor. I made the point earlier, we make value judgments. If this isn't hurting anybody else, if it's not causing suffering, if it's not causing distress, it isn't the business of psychiatry to get into personal thoughts of people that don't cause any difficulty. So if he's thinking that, it isn't interfering with his life, it isn't hurting anyone, under those circumstances, no, that's not a disorder.
And he wouldn't be a mental disorder?
I'm agreeing with you to answer directly. Yes, I agree that would not be a mental disorder.
There are many people, are there not? Maybe it's someone that, maybe it's the woman next door, or a man with an attractive woman. Maybe she works in the backyard, dresses scantily. She's a normal person. He watches her and sees her relatively frequently, has intense sexual desires, very intense, experiences erection maybe every time he sees her, fantasizes what he would like to do with her, thinks about it, maybe masturbates about it from time to time. And she's there through the years and he's watching her through the years and he wrestles with it. And she's a married lady, and he is not going to move on her, and he wrestles with those urges, and he doesn't move on her. He's not mentally disordered, is he, doctor?
I'm pausing because some men would move under that circumstance, but I wouldn't say they're mentally ill, no.
And there are people that have jobs together, people that are married. One is married to X, the other is married to Y, and they're thrown together by chance. And they have a keen sexual attraction to each other. They may never communicate it. They may work for years, and out of a sense of dignity and respect and for their marriage and their spouse, they may be powerfully attracted to that woman. Try to push out the fantasy, but they're working with her every day, and that fantasy comes back, and they're sexually aroused by it. And they may dream about it, and they struggle with it for years. And they don't even express the affection for the other person. They don't even communicate with their eyes. They control themselves and they wrestle with it. And those fantasies come back and those desires come back every day and they struggle with it. There are such people, are there not, doctor?
Well, I might want to examine that person to see if he's ill. If I ask the average guy if he's walking around all day having to constantly fight off these repeated intense urges and fantasies, been doing it for months, I would wonder whether or not he was ill. I wouldn't say based on that he is, but it would be reasonable. He said he's suffering. We got into the ballpark that I said can make you a patient. It would be reasonable for me with this suffering person to wonder whether he ought to be a patient.
We'll strike the suffering. He's not suffering.
If you start taking enough of it away and make him a normal guy, I'll agree with he's a normal guy.
All right. What I'm saying is, and you know what I'm saying is, that there are people that have intense sexual urges, that have recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasies.
And I'm saying some of them may have
about women if it's a man, about one man after another if it's a homosexual, if he's a homosexual, about a woman towards a man perhaps, and we expect those. We don't call them mentally disordered people, and yet their desires are very strong, their fantasies are very strong, and they are not considered mentally disordered for that, are they, doctor?
I think I've answered your question.
And the answer is that they are not considered mentally disordered.
Well, there were several answers because you phrased it several different ways, but I think I've responded.
You and I know that we expect people with strong sexual desires merely because it's a man for a woman, or maybe another man for a man. Under circumstances, they're expected to control themselves, are they not?
You heard me say I don't want to excuse sin by calling it illness, but I also said I don't want to think that somebody's just misbehaving when they're ill. Some of the examples you've given me suggest someone's probably pretty normal, and we need to hold people responsible and accountable. If, however, someone becomes impaired in some fashion, then we are mandated morally and ethically to factor that into the equation when we decide what it is we're going to do about that individual.
There are men that go away at the armed services Strike that. Give another one. A man, a very normal man with strong sexual desires, and perhaps his wife becomes disabled in some fashion, seriously disabled, maybe at a nursing home. He has very strong sexual desires, fantasizes about it, strong sexual urges, but he is very much committed to his wife and very much committed to the dignity of that marriage. Perhaps for moral reasons, he does not even agree with masturbation. He does not masturbate. He contains himself, and he goes forward and abides by it. Isn't tortured by it, doesn't suffer by it, but has those strong desires and those strong fantasies. Well, is he a mentally disordered man?
No, as a compassionate physician, I might want to counsel him and help him, but I'd never say that I am labeling him as mentally ill.
At some point, the defendant said to virtually everybody, the police and everybody else, that he stopped trying.
Yes, sir.
And then I don't know, somewhere there's the word embrace, that he embraced this. I don't know, was that in your direct examination? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, and I know you're not trying to do that. I don't recall that word.
Have you ever heard, and I think it's from Pope's Essay on Man, the statement that the vice, at first shocking, then tolerated, finally embraced? Do you recall that in that Pope's Essay on Man?
I couldn't have quoted it back to you, but I think I've heard that somewhere along the way.
In part of your literature at the Johns Hopkins, does this quote appear? Admittedly, sometimes it is difficult to determine whether a person is trying their best and failing or just not trying. Does that sound like a quote from the literature at the Johns Hopkins?
It's not just a quote from the literature, it's a quote from something I've written.
Yes. And that's accurate, is it not true?
Yes, I've tried to make that very clear, that we have to distinguish between whether someone's trying and whether they're not trying, but also to put it into the bigger picture, because I don't want you to take out of context what I said. If someone's been so beaten down by an illness that they can't control, that they've given up the fight, that also needs to be considered. So I absolutely said that. I agree with that, but I want it not to be taken out of context.
Yes. And in terms of... all of us are going to, all the professionals are going to be asked this question, and in my opinion, should be asked this question, so the jury knows.
Sir?
I don't want you to take offense at it.
That's fine.
You undertook to take this assignment, as did all the professionals, on the arrangement that there will be certain fees paid,
Yes, sir.
probably on an hourly basis. I'm not sure. Did you make such an arrangement with Mr. Boyle?
Well, I'll explain my arrangement. I've been involved for several months. I think I've received about $3,500. He told me there wasn't a lot of money available. He said he could guarantee it up to $10,000. I told him I've never refused to come, even if people didn't have the money, but I certainly would be grateful to have the $10,000. He's assured me at some point that would be available. And I pretty much tell that to any attorney. I feel strongly about this, so you forgive me, but I'm not a hard hand. I call it as I see it. It is immoral to refuse services to people that are poor, and that was the understanding that we made.
Well, you're speaking of Mr. Dahmer himself individually or his family?
I understand that this has been a tremendous expense for his family. I did indicate I'm trying to earn a living too, so I'd submit a bill. I said if they weren't able to pay it, I would not make an issue out of that, but I expect that I will probably get in total $10,000 because Mr. Boyle's told me that.
Doctor, before Mr. Dahmer was sentenced on the second-degree sexual assault case, he was referred to a Dr. Charles Lodel. Is that correct? A psychologist for certain tests?
Yes, that is correct.
And you were supplied that, and is it safe and true to say, accurate to say, that he lied a number of times in his statements to Dr. Lodel?
Again, there's been so many doctors here. I need to be careful. If you want to refresh my memory further, I can answer. I remember Dr. Logo's name and reading that amongst the various things I've looked at, but I don't want to answer something when I'm not sure I'm correct.
All right. In discussion as to the second-degree sexual assault case, Mr. Dahmer is now relating this to Dr. Charles Lodel. Okay. Mr. Dahmer said that he did not intend to engage in sexual contact with the lad. Did you believe that's true or a lie?
No, that's a lie.
Mr. Finally, when talking about the earlier, what he described as urinating in the park, finally, Mr. Dahmer brought to my attention the fact that he'd been arrested for lewd and lascivious conduct approximately 1 year ago for urinating in a county park. Did you believe that? that it was just urinating?
No, not for a moment.
And that would be a lie then. Is that true?
Yes, sir. In fact, this may be the report where Mr. Dahmer didn't even indicate it was a boy. I know one of the doctors that saw him didn't even realize it was males rather than females. I'm not sure if this was the particular one.
This was a doctor to which he had been referred by his counsel at that time.
Okay.
And then also that he said to that Dr. Lodel that he has a regular prescription for sleeping pills from a physician because of problems he has sleeping during the day. That was not true. He was getting those prescription pills for certain other, for drugging people.
Well, again, I don't want to quibble. He at times, I think, took a few of these for sleeping. I know we don't want to name the medicine, but it can be used for that purpose. So he did sometimes use it himself for that reason, but obviously that was not the major reason why he was getting it.
So it was not being truthful in talking to this psychiatrist.
That's absolutely correct.
And that psychiatrist concluded, of course, based his opinion in part on what Mr. Dahmer had told him, no doubt.
Well, I don't want to comment on that. I mean, it seems reasonable, but you'd have to talk to him to know exactly how heavily he weighed what Mr. Dahmer had to say.
At any rate, this psychologist, Mr. Dahmer, in talking to this psychologist, to whom he had been referred by counsel, told at least a number of lies.
Yes, in fact, I don't know of any professional that he had been honest with and revealed the truth of this to at any time prior to being apprehended on this occasion.
That's all.
Direct.
I have some. The fella that Mr. McCann was talking about, the person who lives in the house and sees the lady next door, and he watches her and she's scantily clad and he gets excited and he has these fantasies about it. I believe you answered that. Now I want to ask you about that same fella who then brings the woman over to his house and drugs her and kills her and makes love with her in a dead state, and then dismembers her body and keeps trophies and then moves to another town. And assume that same person that Mr. Can talked about does the same thing in Kansas and the same thing in Nevada, and he keeps on the same pattern over and over again. Might you want to talk to that fella to see maybe if he might have a mental illness such as he needs treatment for it?
Well, obviously, one would be very much wondering in that case if a person is mentally ill.
Because it's not just being sexually aroused or horny that counts. It's what it does to you and what you do about it that is a definite component, correct?
Certainly, I mean, you used the word horny. People get horny, and absolutely that shouldn't be defined as a mental disorder. Things that all of us experience should not be defined as mental disorders. But when we get into mental experiences that we don't ordinarily experience that cause all sorts of problems, then I'm comfortable saying that talking about that as a mental disorder is not unreasonable.
Now, Doctor, Mr. McCann asked you a lot of proper questions about Mr. Dahmer's sense of controlling his environment, being able to control what he is doing in his life and how he lies to people, that kind of control, the kind of control that he was able to fool a judge and a psychologist and everybody else he talked to. Persons suffering from mental diseases, is that equivalent to the concept that all of them are also dumb and stupid?
Well, the answer is no, it's not equivalent.
A person can be severely mentally ill and not be dumb or stupid, correct?
Absolutely. There's a difference between mental retardation, which refers to a level of intellectual capability, and various other kinds of mental disorders.
Your position as a psychiatrist talking to people who are mentally disabled because of schizophrenia, when you talk to them, they don't appear dumb or stupid, do they?
One could do an IQ test on someone with schizophrenia and might discover they're extremely bright in terms of intelligence. They're two different aspects of mental life.
And you can carry on a conversation, a layman could carry on a conversation for a schizophrenic who's in his schizophrenic mode and not have any idea that he's talking to somebody who's mentally disabled, correct?
Well, that might or might not be true. Many of the people with schizophrenia become delusional, hallucinated, they start acting suspicious and so on. So no, that's not necessarily the case in the example you're using here of schizophrenia.
So the fact of Mr. Dahmer's total and complete control over whatever he was doing in life and all of these lies that he told and all of the subterfuges, does that in any way, knowing all of those things, in any way alter the opinion you gave here in court?
No, the fact that he wasn't telling people he'd been out there killing lots of folks in the context of him, as I believe it, having kind of given up and seen it as his destiny. It's interesting in the article in Necrophilia, that's an exact word of one of the other people used in a case example that had reached a point where he thought it was his destiny. So one issue is, assuming for the sake of this discussion, he can't control it and he's kind of given in to the illness. That's one issue. Does the fact that he then lied and hid it and didn't tell people change the conclusion? No, it doesn't. It would have been nice if he would have been telling the truth, obviously, but the idea that he would have been expected to tell people I'd been going around killing people, particularly when the probation officer kept saying, if you tell us anything, you can go back to jail. The idea that when there's a part of him that's pushing and wanting him to do it, that part of him, metaphorically speaking, might not bring him on his own to volunteer it, that doesn't surprise me. So I hope I've answered your question, but that's how I would see it.
In order to be a necrophiliac, is it necessary that you kill every person you come in contact with where the scene is such that you can kill?
Of course not. When I was asked earlier, for example, about obsessive compulsive disorder, where the question just assumes that these people are compulsive, and a contrast was attempted to be made between obsessive compulsive disorder and paraphilia. I worked with obsessive hand washers, so maybe this will help clarify if I can tell you what I saw with them. Recall I was at the Maudsley in England, and I'll just give you, it's getting long, and I'll give you one example to keep it short. But this was a woman, and I won't use her name, but she was an obsessive hand washer. Every morning before she could go out to work, she would spend about 2 hours washing her hands. She'd go through this procedure, and she had to do it just so, and would continue to do it, and really couldn't bring herself to stop. So she'd spend a few hours. Her hands were so raw, they were red. She'd get through work in the morning. She'd still be thinking about it. It'd be on her mind, but she managed to get through work. At lunch, instead of going to lunch like other people, she was again doing this, and it would take her almost the hour. Sometimes she'd be in difficulty for being late because she couldn't stop within the hour. She'd kind of muddle through the afternoon with the thoughts, go home and go through this ritual for a couple of hours when she got home. Now, if you didn't know anything about this disorder, you could make the observation, well, gee, she was working in the morning, and gee, she was working in the afternoon, and it looks like she's just choosing to do these things on her free time. But I can tell you that this lady absolutely was not able to stop this. This was no doubt an obsessive compulsive disorder. And this lady, certainly before she got into treatment, in spite of how obvious it was to everybody how driven she was denying she needed help, and it was necessary to really confront her before treatment could begin. So I hope that's an example of how, she's not doing it 24 hours a day, all the time, regardless of what the circumstances might be. Various circumstances can impinge on it, but she was going to end up doing it because this clearly was a compulsion that this lady couldn't control. So that's the phenomenon that I believe we're trying to deal with, and I won't belabor it. I've tried to explain it in several ways, but I hope that makes my point.
Mr. McCann got into some questions about the field of psychiatry as opposed to the field of non-psychiatric medicine, right, where you can look at an x-ray and see a broken bone. Obviously, you people have not developed to that point. Tell us, as you wanted to, the difference between these concepts of where the science, soft science, as he called it, of psychiatry is, as opposed to the hard sciences that exist in other fields. Tell us the difference. Well,
I started to do that. For example, in the use of medications, we require what's called a double-blind study. The same rigorous experiments he was, he's doing his job, but it sounded like he was suggesting we don't do that. We wouldn't give a new drug to a psychiatric patient unless it had been studied. Nobody knew whether the person got the real drug or the placebo drug, the same thing in general medicine, and there have been rigorous scientific tests to show if, for example, that it alleviates depression, that it really does it, that it's not just a pill that someone is, for psychological reasons, thinking alleviates it, that there's a pharmacological basis for that. We now know a lot about how those drugs act. We believe there are certain chemicals in the brain that are awry in diseases like schizophrenia and certain forms of depression. We can talk a bit about precisely what they are. We can demonstrate that all of the drugs that are effective in some of these disorders seem to have an in common, the fact that they affect the very same neurotransmitters in the brain that have been hypothesized to be the problem in a condition in the first place. We can talk about the typical age of onset in the same way I can tell you the typical age of onset of measles. I can talk about whether there's a family history in schizophrenia. I can tell you about genetic tests that show whether people are genetically predisposed. I can talk about the course of action over time, just as I can tell you if someone has asthma versus somebody has lung cancer, what the course will be. I can tell you pretty accurately if they have schizophrenia versus manic depressive illness, what the course will be. I can go on and give a lecture, and I'd love to, about those aspects of psychiatry, but that's what I was talking about.
So you're saying it's not as much of a, quote, guessing game as some people like to make it.
Years ago, I had a degree in psychology, and I wondered, do you want to go all the way through medical school just to then be able to practice psychiatry? And way back when, I'm not sure it did make a lot of sense to have to be a physician to be a psychiatrist. The big excitement these days is the evolving knowledge about the relationship between mind and brain, the understanding about how we are, in a sense, complicated pieces of machinery, how various abnormalities in brain as a physical entity can affect mental experience and be reflected in behavior. And being a physician and having that grounding is very important. A psychiatrist is no less a physician than a surgeon. I'll give you some other areas have a bit more in terms of technology. Some have a lot more. There are just as many uncertainties in some other areas. If someone has an abnormal glucose tolerance test, there are big debates whether that's diabetes or isn't it, and how often does it have to be abnormal before it's diabetes or isn't it. Sometimes it's crystal clear, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's very clear it's a paraphilia, sometimes it isn't. The differences between psychiatry and the rest of medicine made to the uninformed seem great, but they're not nearly so great as I was afraid was being suggested.
Now, let's talk about different people in different professions. You got policemen, and they may become sergeants, detectives, captains, inspectors, chief. You got lawyers, judges, appellate judges, justices of the Supreme Court. You got doctors who practice family medicine, general surgeons, specific surgeons, to cardiovascular thoracic surgeons, to neurosurgeons. Let's talk about psychiatrists. Is forensic psychiatry like being a chief justice, or is it like being a chief of police? Where does it fit into the realm of things?
Well, again, how to answer that? There's no requirement. In order to practice medicine, you have to be licensed by a particular state. In order to be, you could call yourself a psychiatrist, just as you could call yourself a surgeon if someone would let you operate, just because you're a licensed physician. But then there are certain specialties. If you really want to be considered legitimately a professional, where you have to get certified. I talked about that I'm certified as a specialist by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. Surgeons get certified by a comparable board in surgery. And maybe I was, I'm trying to be modest here, and maybe I went a bit too far here, but when you talk about forensic psychiatry, there is no formal requirement. There's no formal specialty of forensic psychiatry, the way psychiatry is a specialty in medicine. And so people that are drawn into the courtroom in the course of their work as a psychiatrist can rightfully call themselves a forensic psychiatrist. And I said I was trying to be modest, but I guarantee you, if you ask most of my colleagues whether they think Fred Berlin is one of the prominent forensic psychiatrists in the country, and I don't mean to boast, but I wanted to not mislead by being overly humble, they would say yes. Now, what I had said yesterday, there's one of the groups, I belong to the two major groups of forensic psychiatrists that have decided relatively recently that they want to certify people as having specialty. But it's very different from the formal boards that are sanctioned. It's just a small group of people that are trying to develop. And in fact, the American Psychiatric Association is debating whether or not they should make forensic psychiatry a subspecialty. As of now, it isn't. And so I simply said yesterday, I didn't take that test. I don't think it's important. There's a lot of things out of my real area of expertise that I don't get into. But I can't stand here, and nobody's going to be able to say it isn't true, that I am a forensic psychiatrist. I'm asked to write in the two major journals. I'm asked to review articles that they publish as an expert in forensic psychiatry to see whether or not they're acceptable. I don't mean to get worked up, but I kind of, I was trying not to be too boastful yesterday. It may have misled, and I'm certainly as much as a forensic psychiatrist as most others that call themselves that.
Now, the cancer concept that you told us about, the cancer of the mind, and you've explained that it isn't really a cancer as such. It was a term given to you. We all know that a cancer in the body left unchecked will be perhaps fatal. True?
Absolutely.
It grows. Mm-hmm. How about the concept of the cancer of the mind left unchecked. As a psychiatrist, what would you expect about that?
Well, the same thing, and that's why I thought it was a useful metaphor. You know, in our society, we sometimes have the sense if you can't do an X-ray and show it, it isn't real. Depression is real, and people suffer with it, and they describe it, and we can see in their behavior it's reflected, and we as doctors try to deal with it. Mental disability, mental impairment is real in a variety of ways, and there's been so much misunderstanding. Advocates now try to make the point just because the doctors don't have an X-ray yet doesn't mean that mental impairment doesn't really happen. That's why I felt this metaphor of cancer of the mind was so useful. The mind, metaphorically speaking, can become broken or impaired in a variety of ways. Old people, where they become demented. We may on X-rays nowadays see that there's certain atrophy of the brain, but before we had those tests, they were still becoming demented, and psychiatrists saw it by seeing changes in personality, changes in intellectual level, changes in functioning. To say that those people, when they got older, were now choosing to misbehave would be to miss the reality that mental impairment is real. That's the point I'm trying to get across by using that metaphor.
Mr. McCann, yesterday in this, I don't know what you call these overlays or whatever it's called, quoted this statement about many psychiatrists, however, believe that psychiatric information, you know what I'm talking about.
The one about whether the volitional prong of the
Yeah.
insanity defense.
And then he brought in, because I asked him for the source, and it's now marked as state exhibit number 29, and that was a overlay was 2, 4, 6, 7 sentences out of, or 7 lines out of this document, I think, yeah. That is 681 through 7 pages report. I'm going to ask you, is that shown to you so that you knew from whence it came, that Mr. McCann gave it to me, that I in turn gave it to you, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, now that is what is that thing that you have in front of you? Are you familiar with that?
Well, it says American Psychiatric Association statement on the insanity defense, and it's by the Insanity Defense Work Group. And I am aware that there is a group appointed by the American Psychiatric Association to review their stance on the insanity defense. We all know that it's a very emotional type of defense. People have talked about it for a long time. In this state, the prong of volitional is there. So people have had differences of opinion. I can tell you my opinion if you ask. If you don't want me to, I won't. But I am aware of that.
It's a workshop, wasn't it?
It's a work. I mentioned I was on a certain group that the American Psychiatric Association had to help define the nature of the paraphilias. They have other groups to deal with other issues they think are important. So this is a group of psychiatrists that have come together to deal with this particular topic.
What we're talking then about is academics sitting down, making their thoughts known as what they feel about certain other matters in the academia field.
Yeah, and that's the importance of academics. You don't just sit around and hope for the best. You try to make it better. You look at whether you're doing it as well as you could. That's, to me, an exciting aspect of academics.
I don't mean to belabor the point, but you know, certain words seem to give them a great import. And the word forensic sounds like if you're one of those, you're really brilliant. What's forensic mean?
That's why I didn't want to play it up. It just makes the point that there's an interfacing at times between medicine and law. It can be the medical specialty of psychiatry and law. And that's all that we're talking about here. It doesn't mean anything more complicated than that.
Assume that the court system says or finds that it is necessary because of human beings and their misconduct to have somebody who is a trained psychiatrist present to talk to people when need be by the court or by their lawyers to find out whether or not they're competent to stand trial, whether or not they understand what's going on, whether or not they're suffering from a psychiatric problem. And assume that the court appoints a psychiatrist and then ask that psychiatrist to look at a certain person and report his finding or her finding to the court. That person then would be called a forensic psychiatrist, correct?
They can be. I told you I've been asked to lecture judges, colleges of judges, and when I'm doing that about my area and talking to the judges because they've asked me to come and do it, I'm being a forensic psychiatrist.
Let's talk about a pathologist. a person is in the hospital and he's suffering from a disease, and they take biopsies of certain organs or parts of the body, and they send them down to the pathology lab, correct?
That's correct.
And then that pathologist does a study of those organs and disease and reports back to the treating physician that it looks like your client or your patient has lung cancer because these biopsy shows presence of cancer cells. That's what a pathologist does, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, let's assume that while that same patient is in a hospital, somebody comes in and shoots the patient, and they're taken over to the medical examiner's office, and a pathologist does a complete study of the body and reports back that that person died as a result of the gunshot wound. That person then, if called upon to testify, would be a forensic pathologist.
At that point, he would be functioning in the role of forensics pathologist. But to be fair, if he had only done it on that one occasion, he probably wouldn't call himself that. On the other hand, if his work tended to bring him fairly often into the court, as mine does, for example, then he'd probably say, yeah, I'm a pathologist, but I'm also comfortable saying I'm also a forensic pathologist.
So it isn't like being a judge or...
It isn't that you need, I can't say that I'm a board certified psychiatrist if someone doesn't certify me.
You mean board certified? You are board certified.
Yes, I said if I didn't, most people would really be worried if I was just putting out a shingle after I completed my internship and saying I'm a psychiatrist. There, you really need to have the board certification, in my opinion, to do it. I said technically you could do it. There's not a law against doing it, but that really would be something you ought not to do. That is not comparable to what we have when it comes to forensic psychiatry. It is not. It may become. I don't want to mislead you. There's talk about whether they should make forensic psychiatry an official subdivision that psychiatrists can become certified in. But as of now, that doesn't exist.
I'm satisfied we can.
All right.
Let me ask you this, Doctor. There was some question about the amount of time you spent here. All right?
Yes, sir, there was.
Did you spend all of your time talking to Jeffrey Dahmer to try and determine whether or not he was suffering from necrophilia?
Listen, I wanted to be sure to talk to him about that, but, this wasn't a tough call. I can't imagine it would take a skilled psychiatrist in this area to need hours to come to that conclusion. I'd read, as I said ahead of time, the confession. I knew he was using terms in there about urges and fantasies, exact words about compulsions. I had descriptions of all sorts of, again, I apologize, but disgusting sexual acts with corpses and so on. There's a high index of suspicion what we're dealing with. So just in terms of the issue of does he qualify for a diagnosis of necrophilia, there's other things I needed to do, but that part of it wasn't likely to require hours and hours, and indeed it didn't take long once I got into seeing him to be persuaded that indeed he has necrophilia. So that was not going to take a long time, that part of it.
What part was taking whatever time you decided to remain?
The other important issue was whether, as a result of that, he lacked substantial capacity. Now, again, even there was I needed to talk to him, obviously, but there was a lot of other things I had looked at. I talked before about the time when he brought the young Laotian boy in. There was a body on the floor. It was almost like the policeman was there. Everybody saw where he went. I won't go through that litany again, but, I kind of, in that example, when I used it earlier, was that evidence of someone in control or out of control? I made the point, looking at it all, he sure seemed out of control to me. But I had to address that, so that took some time. But again, with all the evidence available, I was feeling pretty comfortable that this, particularly towards the end, looked very much like someone out of control. The tougher parts were that I wanted to be sure I wasn't missing anything, and there are other diseases. I made the point I have to make a differential diagnosis. It wasn't clear to me, for example, whether he had schizophrenia or delusions. I knew he was watching various movies. He was talking about building this shrine. I became aware of that and talking about whether in the presence of all these bodies and having this awful scene of a head in an aquarium in the middle, he was sort of going to get some power. And, this sounds in layman's terms really crazy. Is there some other mental disorder? And I really had to go quickly at that and spend some time, not necessarily in writing notes, but trying to ask questions and think about it and reflect on it as to what was there. I asked even for some additional information on that, and even as late as the day before I started testifying, wanted to again make absolutely sure I hadn't missed anything. So these were the sorts of things. If I'd have needed more time for anything else, believe me, I'd have come back. I wouldn't have come back to make it look good. I'm not going to just, the substance is important. But if I hadn't been able to satisfy myself and thought I needed more time, I would have taken it. And I have spent, I don't put time clocks on, I don't know, but hours and hours and hours of time. And I am persuaded I spent sufficient time with him to do what I needed to do. If I want to publish scholarly papers sometime about him, I'd come back and there'd be more things I need to know. But I don't need to know that to answer the questions that I was needing to address.
You were here on the 12th. What were you in town for?
I'd been invited to come and talk, I guess as an expert in forensics, to a group of attorneys about my area so that they could become more informed. I believe it was the Wisconsin or Milwaukee Public Defenders. I've forgotten the exact name, but it was a group of attorneys who'd asked me to come and talk about the topic.
It was a very large convention, was it not?
Yes, sir. There were, again, I didn't count, but there must have been numbers of hundreds of people.
You were also in town after meeting with Jeffrey Dahmer. You didn't just get on an airplane and leave. You were around for a while, weren't you?
Well, actually, that time I'd driven. My dad, in the midst of this, had some heart surgery, and thank goodness he's okay. But I'd actually driven and stopped later in Pittsburgh. But I would have stayed longer if I had to, if that's where you're going with this.
And you spent a lot of time with me and my staff.
Yes, and you'd come to Baltimore on a number of occasions. There was information I wanted from you. And again, to set the record straight, and I have great respect for the prosecutor. He's doing his job. But the idea that somehow you were misleading me, I did want to correct that. You would get information I was interested in. One of your experts concluded something I didn't, and I wasn't willing to conclude it just because someone else did. You were very, very much being objective. I had no time did I get the sense that you were trying to manipulate.
Object to this self-serving.
Well, I wanted to spread the record straight on Mr. Boyle. Because
Let's have the next question.
Sure. Doctor, was your non-appearance in coming back and talking to Mr. Dahmer on additional occasions because of the money situation?
Absolutely. I had told you ahead of time if I need to come back, I would. I did spend a little bit of extra time with him the night before. Listen, everyone's going to be watching me here. I don't want to make a fool out of myself. I'm not going to be underprepared in a situation like this.
That's fine, Doctor. I had it cleared up because it was asked.
Okay.
I'd like you to, if you would, just briefly, if you can, there has been this use of the word preferred all the time. Mr. Dahmer preferring this, preferring that. You don't like that word prefer.
No. And
Tell us what your explanation is as to where you quarrel with the concept of this preferring business when you start talking about these kind of psychiatric conditions.
Well, I made the point that the DSM-2 and so on used the word prefer with the paraphilias, and it was taken out because it suggests more choice than really ought to be suggested. But let me go beyond that, if I may have. Why didn't I say to Mr. Dahmer, does he prefer this or prefer that? Well, I didn't ask Mr. Dahmer whether he prefers men over women. It was obvious. I did ask him whether he is attracted at all to women because I didn't know that, but I didn't have to ask him, does he prefer men or women? It was obvious. I mean, even Sigmund Freud once said sometimes a cigar is a cigar and it doesn't represent anything more. I didn't ask Mr. Dahmer, do you prefer young males versus older males? Because it was obvious that Mr. Dahmer prefers young males rather than older males. I did ask Mr. Dahmer to tell me the age range of males that were appealing to him. I could go on in this way, but I want to keep it short. I did not use the words with Mr. Dahmer, did you prefer to have sex with people who were dead versus alive? Because it was obvious. He had people there. There were ways he could have restrained them and kept them for days, I would suspect, if he wanted to, without letting them go and continue to have sex with them, either forcefully or persuading them if they were alive. It was obvious that he preferred to have sex with people dead rather than alive. I did, however, ask him to talk to me about what it was arousing for him, what it was about people who were alive. I did find out that he isn't even able to climax most of the time if he is relating to a live person. So I asked what I believe are the relevant questions, but the word prefer, if Mr. Dahmer had said to me, Doctor, I prefer live people. I mean, I wouldn't have bought that for a minute. How helpful would it have been for me to ask him that question?
Okay. Now, Doctor, there's been a lot of discussion here relative to these experimentations of Mr. Dahmer wanting to perform lobotomies, that is, destroying the intellectual portion of the brain, so as to create a zombie-like person that he could use for his purposes as some measure of his not necessarily being a necrophiliac. Can anyone that you know of without great medical training perform the kind of experimentation that Mr. Dahmer started involving himself in to create a zombie-like person in the manner and form in which he tried to do it in his apartment using the type of instrumentalities that he used?
Well, again, the answer to your question is obvious. Of course not.
Now, assume that a person came to you and said, what I am doing in my house is using my children for experimental purposes, and I want to create them into something other than what they are intelligence-wise by destroying their frontal lobe. And what I am doing is drilling holes in their head and pouring liquid down there to destroy their intellectual functioning. What would you think about a person that would come to you and tell you that he was doing that kind of experimentation when he told you that his object is to keep them alive and create zombies? What would you think of that?
Again, it's obvious. I'd need to be taking a very close look at whether or not they're mentally ill. Everybody would have a very high index of suspicion that they probably are. And then I'd set about what we talked about earlier, the business of differential diagnosis, to try to get a clearer and more sophisticated sense of what it was I was dealing with.
A person who attempts to do that, under my assumption, is there any way that person whose brain is drilled by a drill and liquid is poured into it, what's the chance of that person surviving in life?
Well, it says if they got immediate medical attention, depends what was poured in, but obviously that's a very life-threatening kind of a thing to do.
Have you ever, in the history of your course as a psychiatrist, run across a human being who tried to perform homemade lobotomies to create sexual objects?
No, sir.
Have you ever heard of it?
No, sir.
Now, have you had occasion in the last 24 hours to reread the discussion that you came up with yesterday by Dr. Resnick concerning necrophiliacs?
I glanced again at a paper by Dr. Resnick. Again, you'll excuse the volume here, but I think I have a copy here somewhere if you're going to ask me about it. Yes, sir. It's called Sexual Attraction to Corpses, a Psychiatric Review of Necrophilia.
Who wrote it?
One of the authors I know myself well, Phil Resnick. The second doctor, they're both physicians, MDs, Jonathan Roseman. I don't know.
Are they psychiatrists?
I know, as I said, I don't know Dr. Rossman or Roseman. Dr. Resnick is certainly a psychiatrist. If it's important, it may say here, but I'm not sure whether Dr. Roseman, it says he's in the Department of Psychiatry. So
when was that written at, Arnold?
Oh, goodness, it's published in the Bulletin of the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law in 1989.
89?
Yes, sir.
Does it list the study base of what the doctor's findings were?
Well, it's an attempt to review the world literature. I think I did remember correctly yesterday that it was 122 cases that they were able to identify throughout the world. I think that's the number I'd given, and it breaks it down into various categories. Necrophilic homicide was well, that's probably the most relevant one. It talked about what they refer to as regular necrophilia, which had to do with the subgroup of necrophiles who seemed to be able to have sex with corpses without the homicide, and there was an area of necrophilic fantasy also. So those are some of the subdivisions and the essence of what this is about.
Are you able to tell us how many necrophilic homicides the study indicated there were?
Well, I wouldn't have remembered that offhand, but what it lists here, and again, not to misrepresent, it's the word world literature, sometimes they couldn't be sure. If they couldn't be, they tried to be careful and not misclassify. So where they could really pin it down, it got all the way down to a small number of, and it probably is small, thank God, but it's 14 people they list here under the subtype of necrophilic homicide.
And it also indicates that some of those were mentally ill and some were...
Yeah, there's charts, and it talks about whether some of them had psychosis, so whether, male versus female, the average age. Again, I don't know, we've gone a long way. I can read it out, but it gives that kind of information.
So what we're talking about in this courtroom, if and assume that Mr. Dahmer was in fact a necrophilic homicidal person, without getting into the issue of whether he was suffering from mental illness or not, he is part of a database that you are aware of that numbers 14.
Yes, that is correct. And this was, as I said, an attempt to be exhaustive. They didn't even go only with published studies. Usually people don't include unpublished, but they made an effort to get access to all of the literature they could find with respect to necrophilia as a disorder.
I'm about to conclude, Doctor. What I would like to do, if I could, is just to, I take it your notes are written like most doctors' notes, scribbled?
Again, I apologize.
No, just answer that.
Yeah, I did. They were for me. If someone had told me I was to do something more, I would have been glad to. But I wrote them in case I needed to jog my memory. I wasn't expecting them to.
And when I told you that I wanted them to turn over, you gave them to me.
Yes, I've given everything I've been asked to give at all times.
Just wait a second.
Okay.
That's all I have. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. McCann?
Doctor, in terms of the forensic aspect of it, the fact is you have never before testified on responsibility in a murder case. Is that true?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
The fact is that you've only testified 7 to 9 times on the issue of responsibility anywhere in the United States. Is that true?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Doctor, if I were to tell you that an experienced forensic psychiatrist would know that there would be a question about notes and there would be a demand for production of notes, would you accept that as a fact?
I'm certainly not going to call you a liar, so please don't misunderstand. But I haven't testified in that way in court a lot. I've testified many times, and nobody had ever asked me for my handwritten notes before. So that's the only way I can respond to your...
Doctor, you testified in the Ross case, did you not?
Yes, sir.
You got into a hell of a row over your notes because you wouldn't produce them down in the public defender's office and so on. Wasn't there a dispute in that case?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
In the case where the prosecutor...
So which, was it Kirk or Ross? Let me make sure I've heard you.
The Ross case in Connecticut.
I sent everything that I was asked for. The prosecutor made a big deal, I think, I wasn't there, that there should have been more, but I have never refused to forward anything I've been asked to forward. In fact, if I thought I was going to exclude myself by not forwarding, why would I want to do that?
Well, so that you anticipated that your notes, there would be a request by the prosecutor to forward your notes?
No, sir, I did not anticipate that, but when I was told they were wanted and Mr. Boyle said, send them to me, I sent them immediately. If I'd been asked to do more with them, I would have done more.
If you had been experienced, sir, in terms of testifying in murder cases, you would certainly know that the prosecutor
would want your notes. If you want to consider me inexperienced on that basis, I'll give it to you.
In terms of there are forensic fellowships, are there not?
Yes, sir. I teach forensic fellows.
And that is to extend on. You did not go to such a fellowship yourself. Is that true?
No, but I teach them.
And do you run the fellowship program in forensics?
No, but I'm very good friends with Dr. Rappaport, who does. I've been asked to be the one to come in and teach on many, many occasions.
Have you ever been asked to run the forensics program?
No, sir, I have not.
Because you're not qualified to run the forensic program.
I wouldn't. No, listen, again, I'm not trying to boast, but I suspect there's some programs like that would be delighted to have me.
There may be, doctor, but in terms you have not been invited.
I have not. There's lots of things I haven't been asked to do. That's one of them.
Those that know you best have not invited you to head the forensic program. Is that true?
I'm going to object on that question. That's a little insulting.
Well, I just,
Those who know you best.
oh, that's true, isn't it?
Wait,
Yeah.
I think it's argumentative, and I also think it's repetitious. Established, let's go on to something.
Doctor, would you look to that exhibit, the American Psychiatric Association statement?
Yes, sir.
You say that's just a statement of a working group?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were asking about these published paper. If you can hang on one
Published
second.
paper.
Well, I said what I think I said. I hope I'm not correct. I said that my understanding is that this insanity defense work group is a group of the APA that's addressing the issue. That's what I think it is.
Would you read the first footnote on the left?
If you're talking about the very bottom here, because it's a Xerox and it's difficult, but I'll try to get through it. I think this statement was approved by the Assembly of District Branches of the American Psychiatric Association in October of '82, by the Board of Trustees in December '82. The Insanity Defense Work Group involved the following: Warren Roth oh, I'm sorry. Do you want me to read all the names? The first
All the names aren't
name is
necessary.
Warren Roth.
The fact is that this is a statement of the American Psychiatric Association Board of Trustees, is it not?
Well, it was approved by them, and I'm not sure I addressed that issue. What I said was that this group was a group appointed by that board, but I was not aware they'd approved it. So if you're asking if I knew that, I didn't realize that.
It's clear you didn't. The fact is that it is an approved statement by the Board of Trustees, is it not?
It's clear that that is their opinion. I don't agree with it, but it's clear that's their opinion.
Would you not think that persons who were active in forensic psychiatry would be knowledgeable about the basic position on the insanity issue in their association?
I'm not clear that many would be, and the opinion of the group is not so important as whether or not I can decide whether a given individual applies to the categories defined in a particular statute.
Dr. Spitzer, who's mentioned in that group, is he the gentleman who headed the DSM-3R effort?
Yes, Robert Spitzer, and I know him quite well.
In terms of psychiatry as a science, there is disagreement, is there not? I don't want to be repetitious, but even on the area of whether paraphilia is a disease or not.
Well, again, the term disease simply isn't used officially. The word disorder is used, but I have told you I believe there are differences of opinion about the word disease.
In terms of seeing paraphilia as a disease that meets the posture of the ALI, as a matter of fact, you know Dr. Resnick doesn't believe that paraphilias are such a disease, does he?
That's correct. We've been in many debates, and he looks at this very differently.
In other words, the author that you've been talking about that studied the psychiatric review of necrophilia believes that the defense you're presenting is not a defense in terms of the ALI rule.
Right.
I'm objecting to the form of that question unless Dr. Resnick is going to come into this courtroom, make that statement, and be subjected to cross-examination.
It's repetitious. He's already answered. Could I have the last one?
Well, then I move it be stricken and the judge instruct the jury to disregard it.
Disregard the question. Whatever answers were given before is part of the record.
But the court has the discretion, in view of my objection, if it's proper, to inform the jury, because unless it's shown that Dr. Resnick is going to be a witness here to tell him to disregard it. And move that it be stricken, Judge. If it please the court.
I am not going to reach back in the record and try to correct something that's happened before. I will deal with the thing that's in front of the court right now, which is Mr. McCann's question. The question, I gather, really is broad. I will instruct the jury to disregard that question.
I will withdraw the question. The same doctor that you talked about, whose opinion you quoted on the ALA, is the author of the study on necrophilia. Is that correct?
He is that author. That's correct.
In terms of as you know, their psychiatrists disagree on Mr. Dahmer, do they not?
Yes.
The difficulty isn't establishing in the necrophilia, is it? The issue is control. Wouldn't that be true? The doctors are going to say, yes, he has necrophilia.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by control. The issue, according to the statute, is whether, as a result of a disease, he lacks substantial capacity. That's the issue.
And that's the issue. It isn't just establishing. When you say it didn't take you long to establish the necrophilia, what took the issue, what takes long and exact scrutiny to which it was submitted by the psychiatrist for the state, was the issue of conformity. Was it not?
Yes, and I indicated that was clearly a major issue.
And that's the issue that you spent You didn't bother to ask him about all the cases. You made your decision without hearing all the facts.
Excuse me, I went through all the cases. I showed you that I used this outline in order to do that, and I also said that I felt I had spent sufficient time with him to address that issue, and I'd spent many, many hours getting other information that was also relevant to it.
And you felt that spending some less than 15 minutes an incident was sufficient to review his position on the particular case.
I am
Wait, please. This is improper redirect, and it's repetitious. I think this point has been made. It wasn't gone into on redirect, so it's improper recross, and I object to it.
No, he went into how long he spent on it, how much time he needed. That was raised on
The rule is, I make my objection at court rules, and that's what I've done.
Okay.
Objections overruled.
Okay, I'm sorry, the question again?
You spent, if we take the 17 homicides, starting with Hicks through Tuomi, if we take what we all, I think, agree are critical situations, the Flowers incident at the home, the 13-year-old boy at his apartment in September, and the LP incident where the individual left, that's 20 incidences that I assume would need some serious scrutiny in assessing his degree of conformity. Would you disagree with that?
Yeah, I would, because if I was trying to decide if someone was a drug addict, I wouldn't have to ask them in detail at a certain point about every single time they actually shut up to persuade myself. And this is an artificial thing to say, well, divide it up into minutes and figure out how many minutes you spent on this. The whole thing in its totality was intended to answer particular questions. I'm satisfied I answered them. If people feel unsatisfied with the answer, they can respond accordingly. But to make it this artificial thing of 15 minutes was on this guy and that helped them answer this, and that's not the way of the real world.
Doctor, you know that addiction is a physical problem, do you not?
Fine,
Physical addiction.
Hand washing. I don't need to know everything about every time they wash their hand to decide they've got the disorder and to make a decision that they're probably so badly impaired by it that I think such and such.
All right, doctor, he isn't doing it every day like the woman, every day that he works, every evening. It isn't being done with that type of compulsiveness, is it not?
There are people that don't do it every day. It varies.
Doctor, he killed these men.
I'm going to object to counsel what
He killed these men for pleasure, didn't he? You told Mr. Boyle it was pleasure and excitement.
He received excitement and pleasure, not from the killing, but in the ways that I've described.
He did it, the slaying, didn't enjoy the slaying, but he did the slaying for his own pleasure and his own excitement, did he not?
He was experiencing pleasure and excitement from those acts, yes.
You chose, in terms of use of the word prefer. Our doctors, or a doctor can very well collect information as you did, what did he do with the bodies and so on, and also ask the question, what do you prefer? You chose only to collect the information and not to ask the question. Would that be accurate?
Well, I've explained what I've done. I'm certainly not criticizing any of your doctors. I know one of your doctors well. He's a fine doctor. So I've described why I did what I did. Your doctor asked that question. I think he's a good doctor. I hope I've answered that.
And a person that conducts an examination of this sort should certainly secure as much information as possible and then weigh and compare, sift through that evidence, perhaps evaluate what's true and what isn't, and reach a conclusion. Certainly in science, the more information generally makes for the better judgment, does it not?
It certainly does, but asking that question wouldn't have been necessary. I'm repeating myself, but I want to make that clear.
In terms of a drilling, a person might think that one person that would drill another is psychotic. You examine this man and he was not psychotic. Is that correct?
Well, again, you're mixing what persons would think who are lay persons with, medical terms. Just because they'd use crazy. I mean, just because everyone thinks he's crazy doesn't mean he isn't crazy. Most people would probably say, if you wanted to ask me what the guy on the street would say, they'd say he's crazy. I need to do something beyond that. And so I try to look at, does he have a specific disease? Does that disease impair him? What is that disease? And so I looked through the differential diagnosis. I didn't think it was schizophrenia. I do think it's necrophilia.
He is not psychotic, is he?
No, that's what I said.
And the average person on the street wouldn't have all the information that a jury would have, would they? And they wouldn't be qualified to give an opinion without all that information? Or did you read the newspapers yourself and decide that he must be crazy and come out here with your decision already
First
made?
of all, I'd been sent to newspapers, but that's the one thing I didn't read because I didn't think that was something that would be important. I've been sent books, and I didn't read those that had been written. I didn't want to base my opinion on that.
By what you read in the newspaper, did you, when you heard the first reports, did you go, by the way, on any show to talk about this?
People have contacted me, media, even up to yesterday and so on. I think it's inappropriate to be discussing this while it's before the courts. Once I'm finished testifying, I'll think about what to do. But I have refused every request that's been made since I learned that I'd be involved in this case.
Did you appear on any shows before you became involved in the case?
I've appeared on many shows, but I did not appear on any shows discussing this matter.
In terms of the individuals, Mr. Dahmer, and let's talk in terms of general personality traits, Mr. Dahmer did not have strong feelings for the people that he killed, did he?
He had strong feelings, but I think you're getting at empathy, I presume. And
yes.
There he was lacking. In fact, I got into the fact with him that he could empathize in other ways, that if it was a girl there and he had thoughts of killing them, that lots of empathy would raise up, but in the focused area of the necrophilia, it didn't. So he had very strong feelings, but he was not able to empathize in terms of the necrophilic part of things.
You've examined hundreds of documents, have you not, about Mr. Dahmer? Going back, extensive study by the Bath, Ohio Police Department. Did you get those documents?
Yes, sir, I did.
And police interviews,
yes,
a broad range, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you find many acts of kindness in there by Mr. Dahmer at all?
Well, now, with all due respect, this is improper.
No.
I didn't get into kindness.
About what the drilling was?
I'll withdraw.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, gosh, many acts of kindness. He had his friends. Some of them spoke of him in a reasonably positive way. Others didn't. But I didn't see something that, stands out that said, gee, this seems like a very kind guy. I also, by the way, if you looked at the other side, I didn't think there was anything that stood out that said, gee, he's a really unkind guy in terms of what those people were saying about him back at that time.
Would you describe him basically as a narcissistic person interested in his own pleasure?
He's described himself that way. Certainly, he was getting pleasure, as I've said, in relationship to this. I'm being careful because narcissism is a diagnosis, a personality diagnosis, and I didn't make that. But in layman's terms, was much of this to give him self-gratification? In that sense, I'd say yes.
That's all.
No question.
You may step down, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, where are we witness-wise at this point?
Dr. Judith Becker is going to be our next witness, and I think this might be an opportune time because she's about 5-7 minutes away. So if we could break for lunch now and
Okay. We'll reconvene at 1 o'clock then.
1 o'clock. Thank you.
Recess.
All right, please.